This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 744 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. You got less than 2 weeks to pre-order the Late Round Prospect Guide. The guide features profiles for every running back and wide receiver who are at this year's combine. There's pre-draft model scores, rankings, and detailed information about what goes into the model itself. And then there's an entire section on the year 2 model with profiles of second-year NFL running backs and wide receivers. It'll help you figure out what to do with players like Chris Olave or Dameon Pierce or Isaiah Pacheco. You can pre-order now for $11.99 over on lateround.com. I got some good questions this week. Let's get to them. The first question is from @Mikey'd. It says, where would you have ranked Jaxon Smith-Njigba among wide receivers if he was able to come out last year? I feel like I've been in this JSN bubble for the last week and a half of my life and I just can't get out. I can't escape. But I still have more to say about him because I keep seeing more and more takes about him. As I've said in the past, draft capital is part of my wide receiver model. Meaning if a player ends up going higher in the draft than expected, his prospect score is going to change. It's going to get better. And then the reverse is true too. Right now, JSN is projected to go 20th overall on NFLMockDraftDatabase.com. And that places him in the 96th percentile in my prospect model. Last season, Drake London, Chris Olave, and Garrett Wilson had better prospect scores than that. Treylon Burks and Jamison Williams and Jahan Dotson did not. Now, how he would have ranked if he was in that class, I don't know. Because this past year did hurt his draft stock more than likely. And each draft is unique with different team needs and such. So I could just comment on how my model views all of this. And it views London, Olave, and Wilson as better prospects than Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Not by a ton, but they're better. I feel like this has made me some JSN hater. At the end of the day, he's going to be my wide receiver 1 in this class more than likely. I think he's got an extremely good profile, and he's more than likely someone I'm going to be drafting this year. I just have seen this taken way too far. At least in my opinion. JSN is not a Jamar Chase prospect. He doesn't have projected draft capital in the top 10, which is really important. I sent a newsletter out last week to subscribers talking about this. And I talked about it when comparing Drake London to JSN on last week's Mailbag episode. Draft capital matters. There's an inherent evaluation with draft capital. So if JSN does go 20th overall, strictly looking at draft capital, his odds of being elite aren't nearly as good as someone who is drafted in the top 10, if you're only looking at draft capital. So given that we know that he's not a Jamar Chase level prospect, or it appears that way right now, I can't understand the way people are viewing the 102 in rookie drafts right now. I actually continued this conversation about JSN, and I sent another newsletter on Wednesday about it. That one was a little bit more ranty and more qualitative. But there was a tweet from @McNamara Dynasty, who's a really strong follow on Twitter, by the way. And the tweet was referencing a dynasty trade. It asked, which side would you prefer? Chris Olave, Kenneth Walker, and the 111, or A.J. Brown, Elijah Moore, and the 102. And this is a single quarterback league. That's very important. Now, I have a preference for what side I would take here, but I don't think it's like a bad trade or anything. What really got me going with this, because I'm such a nerd about this stuff, was how people were commenting saying that the best 2 assets in that trade were on the A.J. Brown side. In other words, A.J. Brown and the 102 were the 2 best parts of that deal. And I'm just baffled. I don't understand. You're telling me that you would trade Chris Olave for the 102? I mean, you could argue that you shouldn't be trading Kenneth Walker for the 102. I'm lower on Kenneth Walker, so I can understand that a little bit more, but Chris Olave? And yes, some people responded and said that they would trade Chris Olave for the 102, specifically because they think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is a better prospect than Chris Olave was. And this is where I want to talk a little game theory and logic, and how I think about this stuff, because I think it's important to peel back that layer. It is 100% cool and fine and understandable if you think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is a better prospect this year than Chris Olave was last year. There's like a 1 to 2 percentile difference in my model. It's not like I see things so drastically different. This isn't like Jahan Dotson or Sky Moore versus Chris Olave. So you might hear that and you might think, okay, then why is this such a big deal if we like JSN more than Chris Olave straight up right now? If we like JSN more as a prospect, why not trade for him? And the answer is because we've seen Chris Olave dominate in the NFL. Among 50-plus target rookie wide receivers since 2011, Olave's yards per route run rate was 5th best. His targets per route run was 4th best. His target share per game rate was also 5th best. His yards per team pass attempt was 6th best. Even if you don't care about those peripheral numbers, despite them being predictive, he was still top 20 in PPR points per game among all rookie wide receivers since 2011. Olave had an amazingly good rookie season, and it's been amazingly undervalued. Just look at the way that people viewed Garrett Wilson this past year versus Chris Olave. Garrett Wilson won Rookie of the Year, and he deserved to. He balled out. He's great. But his numbers weren't any different than Chris Olave's. In fact, on a per game basis, on a per target basis, on a per reception basis, Chris Olave looked better. You can't just ignore what Chris Olave did as a rookie. Data points in the NFL are so much more valuable than data points from college. It's why if you look at my year 2 model, it's far more accurate in predicting future success than the prospect model is. And of course it is. The NFL is different. Some players dominate in college, but they don't dominate in the NFL. When you have actual evidence of a player doing well at the NFL level at a young age as a rookie, you have to weigh that heavily. Like, think of it this way. What's more predictive of future fantasy football success in the NFL? Chris Olave's incredibly good rookie season in the NFL, or Jaxon Smith-Njigba's great sophomore season in college? I think we all know the answer to that. And as all of you know, I think about this stuff in a non-black and white way. Of course, there's a possibility that JSN is better than Chris Olave. What if he ends up being the best wide receiver of all time? You have to assign some sort of probability to those types of outcomes. What's possible isn't necessarily probable. It's more probable for JSN to have that high of a ceiling than some random wide receiver in this class, yeah. But it's also more probable for Chris Olave to get to that upside, given what we saw from him as a rookie. And how that's aligned with other stud wide receivers in fantasy football. I said this in my email blast earlier this week, but there's a scene from Family Guy where Peter and Lois Griffin are given this opportunity to get a boat. But then they're interrupted by the choice to take a mystery box instead. So they could either have a boat or they could have the mystery box. And there's a very famous quote from Peter that gets thrown out there all the time where he says, "A boat's a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat." I'm all about chasing upside and gobbling up rookie picks to build value on my dynasty roster. I've talked about that at length the last couple of years on this show. But why are we ignoring the potential upside of Chris Olave himself, who flashed that upside as a rookie? To me, it feels like if you're going to trade Chris Olave for the 102, you're taking the mystery box on the chance that you could get a boat. This next question is from @Algies. It says, mailbag question. At the end of your wide receivers that produce like studs pod, you mentioned Zay Flowers. Who is your comp for him? Where does he rank amongst wide receivers pre-combine? Zay Flowers is one of the toughest prospects for me this year. I didn't avoid talking about him earlier this week because of that, though. He just has a weird profile in my model. His stat score really isn't that bad. He had a best season yards per team pass attempt rate of 2.45, which is above average for players in the model. His receptions per game rate was above average too, and then his touchdown share was elite. His best season touchdown share was over 57%. The issue is that his breakout age was not super strong, and he's kind of old now. He's entering the league at 22 and a half. When you mix all of that and his projected size together, it's tough to find reliable comps. You get guys like Ryan Broyles and Marcus Wheaton. Right now, he's in that 90th to 91st percentile range in the model, but we'll see how things shift post-combine with his size and then obviously his draft capital. But he doesn't have the profile that I typically go for. The thing is, though, and I talk about this all the time, but the dynasty community typically doesn't go for that profile either. So I think that's what's going to be really important here. We sort of saw something similar with Jahan Dotson a year ago, where he became undervalued because people just didn't like that profile. But the draft capital was there. His profile wasn't that bad, and people were fading Dotson in favor of inferior players. I kind of feel similarly about Flowers. So there's a chance that my model may not love him versus where the NFL drafts him, but I might still draft him in rookie drafts depending on what the market does. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Cameron. It says, "Hey JJ, you talk a lot about stats you care about for wide receivers and running backs. What are stats you don't like for predicting NFL success? I don't think the wide receiver with the fastest 40 time in their class has ever been successful." Yeah, so my prospect model doesn't use much from the NFL Combine. It does have a weight-adjusted 40-time threshold that it wants running backs to hit, but for wide receivers, it's nothing. It's just height and weight measurements. Now, some might think that that's wrong, but part of the reason I think there's not that much signal is because it's usually captured in draft capital. Like if you had a 20th percentile athlete at wide receiver, he probably isn't someone who's going to get drafted very high in the first place. And he likely didn't have the best collegiate production profile. I do think players likely rise and fall in the NFL draft because of the combine. So it's still important, but it's definitely easy to sort of double count the NFL combine numbers. But like the NFL, the stats that I care far less about are generally efficiency-driven ones, like yards per carry or yards per reception. I think yards per reception can help shape your opinion on the type of player that you're analyzing, but as it pertains to being predictive, I just don't care that much. I care a lot more about the volume-driven stats. So it's pretty similar to what I always talk about. Focus on the volume stats and watch out for the efficiency-driven ones. Next question is from @VinnyBorelli18. It says, "Subscriber to your late round draft guide and huge fan of your podcast. Thanks. First time question asker here. What are your thoughts on Alec Pierce for year 2? So spoiler alert, but I was really surprised by Pierce's score in my year 2 model. He's not in a tier that gives him some amazing chance to be good, but it was better than I expected. My prospect model had him as like a 77th percentile wide receiver coming out, and he's in the 84th percentile right now in my year 2 model. Historically, and this can all be found in the prospect guide, but historically, players in that tier give us a PPR point per game season of 14 or more points at a 15% rate in either year 2 or year 3. Now that might seem really low, and it's definitely not high, but each tier gets progressively worse. The 95th to 100th percentile tier is at 87%. So 87% of them have given us a season of 14 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. Then the next grouping is 48%, then 24%, and then Pierce's tier, which is 15%. A lot of this has to do with the fact that, yes, his numbers weren't great last year, but the Colts' offense and their passing attack was really bad. His yards per route run rate wasn't that far off of Michael Pittman's. And his yards per team pass attempt also wasn't horrific. And that's a number that gives you some team context. I actually think that Pierce is a really good buy low candidate right now, mostly because no one cares about Alec Pierce. I don't think his probable ceiling is that high, but could he give us a wide receiver 2, maybe wide receiver 3 season over the next few years? Definitely possible. The last question is from @TheAtomicGator. It says, "How does your model handle guys like Roschon Johnson who looked good, but were under elite players like Bijan Robinson?" I think it's important to first know that I don't simply take whatever the model says and state it as fact. I have subjectivity that I insert, which would include a situation like this. The model is just a really helpful guide to allow me to not weigh certain variables too much or too little, like early declare status or draft capital or anything like that. I also think what's important here is that it doesn't happen often. This scenario is not common. We definitely have running back profiles from backs who are just misused at the collegiate level. But generally speaking, as a general trend across a larger sample, production will follow good running backs. Very rarely is there going to be an NFL caliber backup running back behind one of the best prospects of the decade. So it doesn't get picked up very well in the model. I just subjectively insert my thoughts, which I think is totally rational. But keep in mind, this is yet another reason why draft capital matters. If a front office likes what they see in Roschon Johnson, then they're going to draft him earlier. And that's then going to get factored into his prospect score. He may end up having a bad draft capital delta, which is a metric that compares how the model likes a player versus how the NFL drafted. But the prospect score is what matters in the end. That's what matters most. And the truth of the matter is that super poor production profiles rarely work out at these positions in fantasy football. Right now, today, we're optimistic that Roschon Johnson can break that trend because he played behind Bijan Robinson and he looks good. But we could look back in 4 years and say, man, he really didn't make a fantasy football impact in the NFL. It's a very possible outcome. So it's subjective. I do have some inputs at wide receiver that factor in teammates, but it didn't seem to matter that much oddly at running back. And I think it's because it just doesn't happen that much. At the end of the day, draft capital is just going to go a longer way for a guy like Johnson. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Head to lateround.com, pre-order that prospect guide. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, everyone. Enjoy the NFL Combine. I'll talk to you next week.